I would describe the HyperBrawl soundtrack as both a dystopian 80s retrospective and an ultra-modern investigation into the soundscape of what is possible in the modern era. You've got to create another world so that the person listening to it is transported into that place, wherever that place happens to be. I'm Steve Levine. I'm the music producer and composer of HyperBrawl Tournament. I started in 1975. As a sound engineer, I worked with many of CBS's great artists of the time. So from the pop world, bands like Sailor, and on the punk world, bands like The Clash. And my first initial success with Culture Club, and ultimately led to all three of their platinum selling records. And since then, I've worked with so many other artists. So on the reggae world, I worked with Ziggy Marley in Jamaica. On the soul world, I worked with Denise Williams, from which I got a Grammy. And on the rock world, I managed to even work with Motorhead. I've done several music scores on motion pictures and loads of television work.
My name is John Holmes. I'm the game director on HyperBrawl. HyperBrawl Tournament is arena-based sports brawling game. Originally, it was inspired by a kind of ancient Italian sport called calcio. Basically started in the 16th century and still actually played out today in Florence every year. It's a very brutal sport, and it was one of the original inspirations for the project. Steve's an absolute legend. It's just a privilege just watching a kind of master at work, really, crafting each of those soundtracks, you know, from the ground up. One of the levels, which was the Prometheus Foundry, it's a big droid factory, so you've got loads of machines and mechanisms in the background. So Steve collected a whole host of objects, went into back alleyways, threw metal objects against metal railings with microphones to capture those unique sounds and to try and get us to bring those worlds to life.
So this is what I use to create the concrete sounds and the metal sounds. In fact, even if I use this chair, look, you can hear how great that is, look. They're so heavy and weighty, and you can still see all the gravel that I used outside. So I was rolling those in the skateboard park along the concrete and created some of the sounds that you hear, particularly when you look at the game and you see, this is across many of them, when you see things moving around, it's often the sound of that in the background. So one of the things we spoke about was the sonic makeup of the drum tracks, and very early on, John and Kevin had played me sounds that they liked from recordings around the sort of early 80s. Fortunately, I still have my original drum machine that I bought in 1982. So, one of the important things about this is the way the kick and snare sound. And this particular snare sound is very reminiscent of many of those records of that time. Perfect kick, and then do the snare. Now I can either be very quick and do it like, and then the hat, which is an important part. But despite my playing, you'll hear this is now perfect. Now those two sounds were really crucial to getting the flavour of HyperBrawl going, because they're so reminiscent not only of that era, these were actually the sounds that those people used on those records.
I'm Scott Swarbrick and I'm a game designer on HyperBrawl Tournament. The soundtracks just completely elevated the gameplay as a whole. He would create loads of chunks of these tracks, so it would just be like, you know, the drum track or the synth track. And then from that we could put it in engine and time it with the game itself. With some of the latter levels in the game, we were still in the process of creating them as Steve was finishing up the tracks for them. So we got to the point where Steve sort of knew the game so well and he knew the tone of the game so well that he created a couple of early tracks for those arenas that we hadn't finished yet. We'd make these blockouts with, you know, there's no art or anything, it's just boxes and triangles and stuff. So I would create these blockouts whilst listening to the soundtrack, and that sort of gave me a load of inspiration, which I could use the soundtrack to kind of develop the world itself.
Probably for me the best quality, or you could say the attention to detail was in them, was the levels that we worked with in that way, where Steve wrote the soundtrack first before we actually designed it, which I think is a really interesting creative approach, really.
Now this is an interesting sound, this arpeggiator. it goes with. So that's 3 things to make that part up. And then there's the soft pop. So that's the synthesizer that appears here. So if I just solo that. It's such a great sound. It's so kind of watery and you can hear it in the track how it adds that crackle.
I've sat there listening to the original soundtrack as a standalone, and looking at it from a non-gaming perspective, it immerses you in this amazing world.
Working with Steve has been brilliant. It was amazing. It was really, really cool. I think, you know, there's kind of 2 main things really. First was his experience in the industry, which dates back to the 80s, so he knew kind of everything that we were trying to go for. And I think secondly, he's just so open to sharing his process and his knowledge, and he'd talk me through every kind of step of what he'd done to create it, how we could tweak it if it wasn't kind of working for us, and just kind of give us the ball as well. So it wasn't just him creating the music in a corner on his own, he was really sharing the process with us.
I'm really proud to have been involved in HyperBrawl. When I look at the rendered images of the gameplay, it's really impressive. I absolutely adore it. I almost feel I could touch those individual characters. I think the music does stand up on its own, and there's been a real move towards music of that kind of style. So within my production CV, I put this quite near the top. And I would say, just as some movies, the soundtrack brings in a different audience, I'm hoping the same will apply to this.
For me, the music in a game is so important. You know, it's as important as the art, as important as the code. It's really crucial, and I think it just really helps give so much more life to the world.